Hello, and welcome to Strange Dominions, where we attempt to unlock the mysteries behind the unseen and unheard, unknown and unknowable. I am your host, Octavian Graves, and tonight I have with me my new co-host, Ian Burton.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It is our pleasure. Ian has been a magician and paranormal investigator for over 20 years. He will be assisting me in interviewing guests, experiencers, and doing on-site investigations and ritual shows. How you doing, Ian? Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about you and what you're bringing to the show?
Okay, well, first I want to say it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to share this space with you, and especially our listeners. And like you said, I've been doing magic and studying things for a while, and it's exciting to bring what is usually a private practice and theory and practice to a wider audience and get to explore that with another magician and with our guests who are extremely varied. And, I've listened to all the episodes so far, and I know we're going to have some really cool people for you guys to talk about and meet. So, I don't really have a lot of labels for my practice, but I've been at it for a while and I've kind of let that magic guide me. And I'm come to a point where I want to share some of that with others, and I want to apply it, and I want to play an adventure. And that's kind of where we met and what we want to bring to the show. We want to go out and do magic with you, together with our different interests in magic and what we've done and what we've practiced. And we want to apply it to realms that are not usually engaged that way. And I think the big focus is things like the paranormal, the different sections of that. And essentially go out in the world and do some of those traditional rituals and see what those parts of the paranormal speak back to us. Because often they're not often engaged with each other. Like the occult and traditional magic is not often engaged with more, ghosts and more traditional paranormal stuff. And that's what we want to do. We want to go out and we want to do some rituals in the woods and in our house and see what happens. Bring you guys along with our successes and our failures.
Absolutely. It's going to be something that you probably won't hear very often anywhere else. We will be doing rituals and magical operations in areas where high strangeness is experienced and recording all of it for you to see what we capture and what calls back to us. And to accentuate this point, tonight is a very special show because it is our very first Halloween show, and we are talking to Kelden Mercury. Kelden is a two-time author with Llewellyn with books such as The Witch Sabbath and The Crooked Path. He is also a traditional witch and a fantastic person. We talked to him about many things, from the history of traditional witchcraft, his upbringing in witchcraft, the history of witch flight and the Witch Sabbath, elements of traditional witchcraft such as the Witch Father and Witch Mother, and a whole lot more. Ian, what was your favorite part of the conversation?
Oh, and it's worth saying, and this highlights my favorite part. Like Kelden is a fantastically erudite scholar, and he is a folklorist. I think he would agree, just as much as he is a practicing witch. And he digs deep into the history and lore, and especially in his book about the Witch's Sabbath, he's going to draw some connections between parts of folklore going back into, medieval and Christian dominant Europe, and how those aspects of folklore play a direct connection into modern witchcraft in all its forms. Everything from Wicca to, the more traditional witchcraft revival. And just honestly talking to him, he's so informed, and he mixes not only, his knowledgeable background and foundation, but he's absolutely one of the kindest witches I've ever met. Just his energy is bright and hopeful, and he's such a funny guy and a positive experience. And just it was an absolute joy to just talk to him and reading him and his books. And he's also a blogger, and if you guys go online, you can he's on Pathos and several other things, and just some of what he writes about is not only original, but it's very inspired. Nothing I've read or listened to from some of his videos didn't catch my interest immediately. And you guys are going to hear his thoughts and his experience, directly in his words. And that's something that you do not want to miss, because it was great to hear.
Absolutely. He was a fantastic conversationalist and a very, very fun guest to have. And it was a blast to have him on the show and to talk with him. There is a Patreon segment to this show. And as always, if you would like to hear that and additional content, you can become a patron starting at just $4 a month. Additional tiers get you merchandise and the opportunity to be on the show. But starting off, you can always just do the $4 tier. Also, if you've seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, spirit, UFO, or anything in between, please send us an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com for your opportunity to be on the show. Without further ado, we bring you our interview with Kelden Mercury. All right, and tonight we are here with author and witch Kelden Mercury. How you doing?
I'm doing fantastic.
We are so happy to have you on. We have both been really looking forward to this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, we have a lot to get into tonight, but I guess we'll just start with, how did this all start for you? Where was your beginning in traditional witchcraft?
Yeah, well, my beginning is not all that different from, I think, many people. There's sort of that really early interest in witchcraft, in magic. That's always been a big part of my life growing up, even as a small child. And when I was about 11, 12 years old, I discovered Wicca. And it was this really amazing thing to learn that there were other people doing these things out there, and it wasn't just me, and there were words and names for things that I had never known before. Where traditional witchcraft came in the picture was really when I was in undergrad. I just hit this sort of plateau where I was feeling really frustrated with the books and the material I was reading. It was starting to feel really stagnant. A lot of, just the same old stuff. And it was a lot of stuff that I was learning wasn't really historically accurate, right? These sort of claims about how old Wicca is. And I grew really dissatisfied. I wanted to find something more. And really, so the way I went about that was by reading and seeking out books that weren't necessarily readily available. So looking at the works of Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente and Farrars, right? These early pioneers who really got this off the ground. And what I came to find is that there was so much more to Wicca than what was being presented. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of things and just how much I didn't know. But it also opened my eyes to the fact that, this really wasn't the path for me anymore. And that's not any sort of critique of Wicca, just the fact that we had grown apart. And it was during this time that I discovered the work of Robert Cochrane and this idea of traditional witchcraft, this sort of alternate path, right? I often describe Wicca and traditional witchcraft as sort of two tree trunks emerging out of the same base. And so I had this whole other side of this tree to explore. And in doing so, I found that a lot of the things that I was learning, a lot of the things that I was encountering were very similar to the things that I had been doing as a kid. These really intuitive, land-based forms of magic and witchcraft, these spirits that I had encountered and just freely formed relationships with as a child. I mean, so it's definitely one of those like coming home moments or stories.
You know, I vibe with that. Just everything you said in my heart is reflective of a lot of my early beginnings in magic too. And sometimes, finding the more mainstream things like Wicca, then eventually it's like, it's time to start another journey. And magic itself can provide. And honestly, some of the most beautiful things and functional things have been the things that I was involved in my childhood adventures. Things that were in no book. And then you find that there are traditions going back that in the modern day, as people dive more and more into folklore and translate old books, that in a way maybe we're kind of there the whole time, that we get to pioneer and discover.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar, what is traditional witchcraft?
Mhm. So, traditional witchcraft at its core is essentially non-Wiccan forms of witchcraft. Wicca is a specific type of witchcraft that has a specific set of core beliefs, core tools, core rituals, core deities to an extent. There is a lot of variation within that, so it's always hard to make these broad brushstrokes. But traditional witchcraft is witchcraft that is non-Wiccan. It's forming its base from other materials. So to go back to sort of that tree example, Wicca and traditional witchcraft draw from a lot of the same roots. So things like ceremonial magic and folk magic and different folklores and mythologies. And when that tree starts to grow and separate, Wicca tends to lean more into the ceremonial side, whereas traditional witchcraft is really rooted in folklore. And it's not to say that either one doesn't, dip its toes into the other in terms of ceremonial magic or folk magic. But traditional witchcraft is a form of witchcraft that is really informed and inspired by folklore. A lot of times, this folklore is very regional to the practitioner. So looking into the stories of witchcraft and magic and spirits from ancestral cultures or the land that one lives upon. A common place you're going to see this come up is witch trial transcripts. So much of our identity and the things that we do as witches really has its roots in the folklore that was generated and permutated by the witch trials. So traditional witchcraft is really leaning into that folklore, working very closely with the land one lives on, working with a variety of spirits. It's a really otherworldly based witchcraft as well. So there's a lot of crossing into the other world. Practices such as spirit flight or hedge crossing are very common. So that's really the core of what traditional witchcraft is.
Thank you for explaining that. And that was, you mentioned hedge crossing and traditional witchcraft going back into folklore. And I know we both do. I want to dig into what you found digging into folklore, both more well-known folk tales and obscure legends. And, I'm a little familiar with your work, and I know you've talked about a lot of the elements that incorporate not only Wicca, but a lot of the modern witchcraft revival stemming directly from things like witchcraft confessionals and the folktales surrounding what was inherently, a Puritan society, at least in America, and kind of taking that back to, at its core, that the land itself is alive and full of magic, and there are spirits everywhere, and they're all unique to the area that you are in and that you are practice. And, just on a small tangent sentence, like I know for me and other people I know who practice magic, some of the first encounters and that draw to becoming a witch or a practitioner of some way, seems to come from that interaction with the land and the spirits there, even before we even know what a spirit is. Because, a lot of Americans, they hear spirits and they don't have any experience with the occult, and they think of like ghosts. But that communication and interaction, it's popping up a lot more in practicing and respectable, people who are really kind of hitting the forefront of witchcraft. And I would consider you, Kelden, absolutely one of those people who are doing really wonderful work and pushing that forward. So I hope we get to talk about all the folklore, because I've been wanting to ask. But, Octavian has been, he's been talking to me for the last 2 days. He's very interested in your ideas on edge crossing and the different flying potions and things of that sort. So
I do, and I definitely want to ask you about that. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is, for a long time, especially, when I was growing up, I remember being 16, my ex-girlfriend calling me up one night and saying, like, hey, I'm starting a coven. Do you want to join? And so I was like, I guess so, sure. And so we did like a group online Skype astral projection thing. And it was a Wiccan thing, and the way she made it sound was that it was like witchcraft from the beginning of time. That is what Wicca was. And I looked it up, and I realized, oh, wow, okay, it's really recent. But for the longest time, Wicca was what you found when it came to witchcraft. And so I'm curious about, obviously, traditional witchcraft, kind of the way it is now, started from Cochrane in the 60s. But have you noticed an uptick in its popularity or its relevance in the last few years, or has it always been there?
Traditional witchcraft has always been a thing, because really at its core, traditional witchcraft is sort of everything else, right? There's Wicca, and then there's all the other sort of forms of witchcraft. Today, we're finding a lot more people using the term folkloric witchcraft, because they're making a distinction between a witchcraft that is more individualized, more rooted in their local folklore, and they're making the distinction in terms of traditional witchcraft is what Robert Cochrane did. I don't necessarily agree with that distinction. I'm never going to tell anyone that they can't make that distinction themselves, but I think it's sort of missing the point of what tradition in this sense means. It means the traditions of folklore, and Robert Cochrane is just one facet of that. So traditional witchcraft has always been a thing. I mean, when we look back to the 1950s, Gerald Gardner's coming forward. The last of the Witchcraft Act is repealed. People can now be witches openly and publicly, not necessarily safely yet, but it's no longer illegal. And at the same time that Gardner's coming forward and talking about this witchcraft that he's been doing and that he's been inducted into, there are people who are disagreeing, who are saying, we've been doing something else. And this really kind of comes to a head after Gardner passes away. But in terms of, is this a recent thing? Not necessarily. I think traditional witchcraft kind of has these spikes in popularity. I think what we're finding today is sort of this really the pendulum's kind of swinging to the opposite extreme, right? Where now, whereas before, Wicca really was the front and center. It was what I think people were really familiar with. We're finding that now it's just swinging this opposite direction, where now, unfortunately, people are, really hating on Wicca, really buying into a lot of stereotypes and misinformation, which is unfortunate because it's sort of going from one extreme to another, when really, I think we need to just be kind to each other and keep an open mind. So traditional witchcraft definitely spikes here and there. I think right now we're we're still in a big increase in popularity, because again, I think people are really looking for ways to connect more to the land they live on. They're looking to encounter different types of spirits that maybe aren't commonly talked about, not necessarily in Wicca as a whole, but the more popular sort of eclectic version that you're going to find readily available in books versus more initiatory forms.
One thing that I always found interesting is that when I got into magic, I would go on. I started kind of as in the Norse pagan realm, and I slowly drifted into more magical forms of paganism, such as like the Egyptian and Greek forms. But I would go on like pagan forums and especially Wiccan forums and talk about interacting with spirits and Wiccan methods of interacting with spirits. And I always got met with a lot of resistance, saying like spirits aren't really our thing. It's not really what we do. But traditional witchcraft seems to really prioritize relationships and working with spirits. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how spirits work within the traditional witchcraft system.
Mm-hmm. So within traditional witchcraft, I mean, there's not going to be like a total consensus on what spirits people are working with, because again, this is highly individualized. So some people are going to work with concepts of deity, right? Gods, goddesses. Some people aren't. Some people are going to focus more on their ancestors. Some people are going to focus more on specific spirits of their landscape, right? So the spirit of the river, the spirit of the trees growing in your backyard, deeper primordial spirits underneath that, familiar spirits, fetch spirits. I mean, there's so many different types of spirits. And why it's so important is because that's one of the hallmarks of a witch, is pacting with spirits, trafficking with spirits, right? We're forming these relationships. This is how we are working magic, right? Magic comes from within us, right? It comes from different sources, but traditional witchcraft is an animistic path, right? We're viewing spirit in all things. So when you're going to do a spell, for example, let's say you are combining some herbs, right? That's not just inert material. Those are spirits. And so it's important that you form relationships with them, because through that partnership, that's how you're accessing and working that magic, right? So, when you're calling upon the virtues of planets, you're calling upon spirits. And it's important, right? Because you don't just demand things of strangers, right? You don't, you don't necessarily ask things without, offering maybe something in return, especially beings that are usually, most often, much older and much more significant than you.
Mm-hmm. Just that highlight of forming a connection and a relationship based on respect with spirits is so huge to me. And I think that's, thinking I'm kind of a 90s kid. I'm 36. So I remember, he was talking about when Wicca was what you found. And that was certainly like, there was a whole vibe to the 90s where it was like, the craft, and then you had Wicca. And then somewhere on the side, you had some, Satanists. And then you had some, maybe you heard about like Crowley or ceremonial magic, if you really dug into it, you found some cool people who were traditional witches. Like I know one of my first, much like you, one of my first encounters with other people that knew magic in a sense beyond myself was essentially a coven, but that was more of a traditional kind of Celtic witchcraft than a Wicca thing. But, I remember that, and that landscape has changed so much since then. And and I'm not going to say that there's like a competition, but like that some people think there is, like, especially when you go online and it's like what you said, there's the pendulum swings one way or another. And now you hear about so many people who are approaching the land in spirits as less of this is just a psychological construct. Like, no, these are parts, they are alive and they have a personality and a weight to them just as much, if not more than you do. And, some forms of magic are very demanding. It's like you put it out there and you want something and you get it. And that's a huge part of witchcraft. But in my personal practice, it's always been better to form that relationship. And I think people who maybe are new to discussing spirits, like many spirits, if you have that honesty in you, I've found a lot of spirits want to connect with you just as much as you want. Not all of them, of course, because some of them are like, yeah, no. You have to form that over time. But you see it more and more. People are moving towards that. They understand that the land is alive. The land is a spirit, and spirits come of it. And all humans have that capacity to do magic. Spirits have it as well, but they can a lot of times do more and more focused. And let me ask you just a quick question, kind of on the same idea. Do you believe that obviously humans can learn ability and insight and, just learn from spirits over their working? Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Like, sometimes it's direct magic or ability, or just over time you become something more and more of yourself from working with spirits. Do you think that the reciprocal is true? Do you think spirits learn and grow from our interaction with us, especially people who practice magic?
Yes. A good example of like a place where I think I see that is just in those sort of interpersonal relationships with spirits. So for example, I often find that the overall genus loci, the spirit of place, is one that tends to be more hesitant, right, to partner and to work with us as humans because of the damage we as humans have done to the environment. But I think through that interaction, right, when you start to demonstrate and show your respect and your care, the genus loci learns from you, right? The spirit of the place you're in learns from you that, right, that there are people that care. Another good example would be the fair folk. I mean, think about how they've adapted over time as human technology has adapted, right? The ways that they've learned how to interact through different means and with different objects. I mean, you could say that about spirits in general, right? I mean, think about the ways, maybe we think just about like ghosts, right? Like things like EVP, like that's changed over time as technology has changed. And so those spirits learn. And they certainly can learn from interactions with us by observing us, just as we do the same with them.
That's 100%. I was thinking about, at some point in this, Octavian, I kind of want to tell him about my pendulum, maybe not right now, and the familiar spirit, and just the work I've done with that is kind of a good example. But on kind of a side note on like the reflective or the reciprocal quality of, spirits learning from each other. And you brought up, the land and how much of it is wounded. And that's 100%. If you spend any time in it with your kind of senses open on that level, it can be difficult actually. And with some genus loci. And I've, in some of my work, I've come across that as well, where you have very angry land, or sometimes it's kind of asleep in different ways. And do you think that with an uptick in, kind of want to say, the magical revival and more people approaching magic and spirit out of respect, do you think that is having a change in the land over time and in a grander level?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that spirits are recognizing, they're going to recognize when you're approaching them with that respect and that love, and that recognition of impact and that taking of responsibility. And I think the more that we do that, as individuals, as a whole, it starts to change the landscape. I mean, you can feel that. I mean, if you go, for example, if you as an individual go, let's say you have a special place you like to go out in the wilds, right? Maybe it's a hiking trail. And every time you go, you bring a trash bag with you and you collect people's litter, right? The more you do that and the more you return to that space and you show it love, you feel that. Right? And so maybe the first time you go, the land feels really asleep or distant, right? Maybe you feel like an overt sense of not being welcomed. But after showing respect, after showing love and care, now when you go, it feels like you're being embraced, right? This is, even on a small level, change happening in the land.
Absolutely. And, for our listeners, because, I know we have some listeners who are getting started in their magical path, and that's why they're here. What are some suggestions that you might have, for people who are listening and they're getting started and they want to go out and try these things? For people who are newer or older, they might be in it, but looking at it from a different perspective. What are some things that they can do when they go out in the world to form that relationship with a spirit of place and the spirits that exist in that place?
My biggest recommendation is to not overcomplicate things. I mean, this is my general approach to witchcraft in general. It's, to me, is another central part of traditional witchcraft, is that this is practical. This is utilitarian. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's lacking mystery or depth. But when you go out, right? So let's say you're going to that hiking trail, just start talking. Talk out loud, talk in your head, say hello. You don't need some big, evocation to summon these spirits, because they're there. Just say hello, compliment them.
It's funny that you bring that up, because one thing that I'm very interested in is grimoire magic and what we would call old ceremonial magic of evocation and things like that. And the importance there is the visualization of the spirit, is bringing the spirit to physical manifestation. And I know that interest has kind of waned in the last 100 years or so. But I'm curious about, in traditional witchcraft, how do spirits tend to manifest? Is there one uniform way, or are there several ways that they manifest into, our reality when we're trying to work with them?
I don't think that there is ever going to be one standard way, because it is impossible to shoehorn spirits into boxes. And I find that anytime we try to do that, that is just an invitation to get knocked on your ass and to be like, whoa, actually, now everything's, uprooted and tilted on its head. So I don't think that there's any one way. I mean, it just depends. I mean, some people, for example, I think it depends too on your own different abilities, right? So like, for example, some people are really good with visualization, right? And specifically visualization in terms of images, right? Other people aren't. So a spirit might materialize as something else, a sound, a smell. It might be sort of a hazy fog. I don't know. I haven't met many people who would say, I've seen a spirit in the same sense that, like, we're seeing each other right now, as these really solid corporeal beings, because that's not what spirits are. So that's the other thing too, is I find, and this comes up with hedge crossing as well, in that spirit flight, is I think people often go, well, when will I know? How will I, I don't know if this has ever happened. More often than not, people have already experienced these things and they just haven't realized it because their expectations are so high. So I think most people have already encountered spirits. They've already crossed the hedge. they just don't recognize it because they're thinking that it's going to be this really strong corporeal sort of thing. And it's just not. That's not how spirits work. That's not how the spirit realm works.
Yeah, I think that I am definitely guilty of having really high expectations of spirits and how they manifest to me. And Ian often gets on me about lowering my expectations and just, taking things as they come and not trying to have them be what I want them to be.
Yeah, it is a timing that just everything you said was good advice, because we had almost word for word, maybe a little more elaborated, this very conversation today because of some of the work we're doing. And, like we come from different paths and different times and, just sharing each other's stuff. But that was, kind of a point I made. And just through my experiences, exactly as you said, like spirits are not physical. I think there is certainly magic in ways working with certain spirits that you could get them to physically manifest in, a specific way. And I think that sometimes in nature or in certain kinds of them, you have instances where they are a little closer to matter, but that's kind of a different thing. But, for people working magic, sometimes their expectations do get high. There's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, like spirits are it's a two-way. So they're gonna send you messages, and each person has their own unique talents and ways that they're good at picking them up. And over time, just the more you talk, you were talking about going in the woods and hiking, because that, your story and example is literally what I do. Like that is like my most common. I have my hiking trails, and I know that land and I love it. I go pick up trash, and that's what I do. Like I'll walk down and I feel it, and like there are individual trees in the river and like certain rocks, and I'll just conversation and be like, like, hello, Sister River, or something like that, or Grandmother River. And that's, you feel it. Like when you walk in the room and like you go into like a coffee shop and there's somebody there and you don't even notice them, but you kind of feel them. And that's kind of how I would describe it. Like you walk down a certain trail, so you get that like knowing like someone's paying attention to you. It's almost like that reach out intent to be like, hey, I know you. How are you? And that just that, greeting it with love and respect, and until it almost becomes common where the spirits love to see you and you love to see them, and in different spots. So just going back to your comment about walking down and taking care of the land and becoming familiar, that vibed with me very hard. But onto what we were talking about before.
Well, I just you brought up hedge crossing, and this is a very interesting topic to me. So I have two questions, not to overwhelm you here, but what would you say, like, what was your initial experience like with hedge crossing and the Witch's Sabbath? And what would you say the difference is between that and astral projection?
So to start, I'll start with your second question, because this is a common question I get, right? So first, you're going to encounter a few different terms come up in traditional witchcraft. So spirit flight, hedge crossing. Sometimes people will use a very fancy term, transvection. And these three are really synonymous in terms of what they're meaning. They're meaning the spirit is leaving the physical body to an extent, and that's important. We'll come back to that. And it is going into the other worlds, and then it is traveling through the realms. How that differs from things like astral projection depends on how then you define astral projection, because there tends to be sort of two variations. There is sort of a classical sense of astral projection where your astral body is going into the astral realm, right? And it's sort of going into another world. It's going through different spheres. And I would say that that's closer to what hedge crossing is. The other variation of astral projection is that your physical body, your spirit is leaving your physical body, and it's sort of traveling around here, right, in our physical worlds, right? So maybe I'm going to astral project to where you are. And that that's different in the sense that there's not necessarily that other worlds crossing. Now, when you cross the hedge, when you go into the other world, there is a way in which you can interact with this physical world. And this is what I would call the hidden landscape. This is sort of the almost like when you're at a movie theater, right? It's like you're taking a step behind the screen. So it's the landscape that's just behind the physical. Now, to circle back real quick to that point, and this sort of goes into when we were talking about high expectations, is oftentimes the expectation is that there is this sort of total separation of spirit and body. And I found over the years that this just is not totally true. There's always going to be some level of connection. The only time that our spirit is ever going to fully detach from our physical body is when we're dead. And that's not good. I mean, unless it's our time to go. But there's always going to be some amount of connection. And this is why I think people are like, well, I've never done that. I can never do that. Because when I do, like, well, I can still hear when a car goes by, or I can still feel, if my arm twitches. Well, those are good things. Because if that wasn't happening, then you're probably not in a good place. It's possible to be in both, right? So my first initial experiences, I mean, again, kind of going back to those early childhood experiences, it's this sort of stepping into the other world, almost in a way that for me is just not, it wasn't even perceivable. It was just sort of almost like going from one room to another. And a lot of times this is happening. And I think for a lot of people, it happens in dreams. It happens when we're laying in bed at night, when we're daydreaming, right? So for example, Andrew Chumbley, who founded the cult of Sabbath, which is, at its core really about this, otherworld travel. He talks about the Witch's Sabbath and this other world as existing at this intersection of waking, sleeping, and dreaming. And that when you're at this intersection, that's when you're crossing into the other world. That's when you're going to these places. So for me, a lot of those early experiences were happening in this sense, right? It was the daydreams. It was, in those moments before falling asleep. And it wasn't until later when I started learning about these concepts that one, I was able to put language to it, and two, I was able to then intentionally do it.
That's really awesome. And it's something that I have a lot of interest in. I remember, again, being 16, 17, desperately trying to astral project. And to this day, I don't think I've ever, I think I did it accidentally once when I was a teenager. But since then, it has not been much of a thing for me. And one of the really interesting things in your new book, The Witch Sabbath, is you talk about doing it with other people and the I guess the objectivity of it, and how even if you do it with someone else, your experiences would be completely different. And that's really interesting to me, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, and if you have any experience with trying to hedge cross with another person and what that experience was like.
So there is this level of, it's everybody's going to perceive and experience things differently. Like that is just an objective truth. If you and I are in an art museum looking at the same painting at the same time, we're still perceiving it differently. We're picking up on different things. And this is still true in a magical sense. We experience, just as we experience spirits differently, we experience the other world differently. And a lot of times the way we experience it is framed around the folklore and the mythologies and the experiences that we have, right? It sort of fills in the gap. It becomes this framework, the flesh on the bones of the experience. So we might really try to purposefully go, to this otherworldly Sabbath together. And we might experience, we might come back and go, this is what I saw. And you might say, well, whoa, like I saw something totally different. And I think that's okay. I mean, yes, it's awesome when you can come back and be like, whoa, we had very similar experiences. But if not, I mean, that's what I think the cool thing is about that exercise, is that there's not really a way of losing, because either way, like you travel to the other worlds and you experience cool things. In terms of doing it together, I've done it with different people, and it's exactly that. Sometimes you come back. I think it's rare to have like a very, very similar experience, but you might be like, well, we were, let's say, dancing around the bonfire, and the bonfire, how that bonfire appears will be different, right? So for some people, it's like, it was a small greenish fire in a cauldron. Oh, well, for me, it was a big, blazing fire, which is interesting too, because when you come back, you're able to discuss, like, why do you think those differences happened? What do those things mean to you individually? So it's definitely an exercise that is a fun experiment, and it's a great way to get to know yourself and other people in terms of what symbolism has meaning to them.
That's really fascinating. And what I kind of took from that, and ask you for clarification, let's say if Ian and I did it, I come originally from a very Norse-oriented spiritual path, and he is very into the Egyptian style, and that is kind of baked into our subconscious. So even if we did it together, expecting kind of to go to the same place, would our individual cultural background or spiritual background influence that? So instead of going to the same place, I went to a more Norse-oriented otherworld, and he went to a more Egyptian oriented otherworld. Do you have any comment on that? Have you ever experienced something like that?
Yes. So that's exactly it. The backgrounds that you're coming from is going to color the experience, unless you sit down together and you say, okay, this is really what I'm intending and hoping to see. It's almost like, it's almost like when you're going to fall asleep and you're telling yourself, this is what I'm going to dream about. This is what I want to experience tonight in my sleep. And maybe it happens and maybe it doesn't, because ultimately the other world is going to decide for itself what it's going to be. But you do have some sway and influence over that, both consciously and subconsciously. So you might go and you might experience these very culturally tradition-based things that are quite different from each other, but then there's still similarities in terms of key experiences. And the other thing too is to consider, like, kind of, it makes me think back to when you were talking about the coffee shop, and you might not see that person, but you feel them there. That would be something else to sort of look for. Like, did I feel that person there? You might not even recognize each other necessarily, because sometimes even we appear differently in the other worlds, and we might perceive each other differently in the other worlds.
I was thinking as you were saying that, and I used to roll with a bunch of, like, used to call ourselves Marauder Mages and some internet collectives not too long ago. And one of those, we were just goofy magicians doing cool magic experiments. And one of the things we did kind of for fun is we had, like, a roving kind of astral nightclub once it was a Waffle House, where we would all kind of, we would kind of pick a sigil and then design it to represent the space in the other world, or the astral, wherever it would be. And then, we'd all meet up at a certain time. We put on, like, the same music playlist, and then we go in our individual methods. And it's exactly as you said, when with some underlying, like, everybody's going to perceive it differently. But then when we all like sat down and like got in a chat or wrote up what we saw, because that's usually what we do. Like we'd share experiences and say, well, this is what I saw. And, I saw you there. And sometimes like one person, and they'd kind of imagine themselves in fanciful astral bodies. And then I remember I saw a friend, and one of them looked like a great big blue electrical lion. And, just as a thing, I talked to him later, and there were a lot of similarities in what we saw, but everybody had their own different shade. And he's like, it's kind of interesting because I'm wearing a lion t-shirt tonight, kind of thing like that. And he had like blue in his hair. And it's just, I think you describing that as, traveling together and having that Sabbath rite and being specific, I think that's going to be really helpful, because I think people start out with ideas because they read certain books, and some books, come out and say it, are a little more informative practically than other books. And that's realistic and that's powerful in the sense that, you're giving our listeners, and in your book, your readers specifically, that's going to give them confidence to know exactly what to expect. And not that can't, it's not like a downplay. That's a great thing. And have you ever, because I know you've written the book on the Sabbath work, essentially, have you ever, well, I should ask, have you ever had really close, like magical mates or close friends that you've always practiced with, or for a period of time where you've done things like the Sabbath together, like specifically where you've kind of had the same place over time? Like over the years, you've kind of, with the same specific people, or maybe a rotating group, as opposed to like, you do it with a stranger here or a stranger there.
Mm-hmm. My work has always primarily been solitary, so I can't necessarily speak to having like a consistent ongoing group.
No, that's totally fair. And one thing that I really enjoyed reading about the Sabbath rite is the interaction with spirit, and how spirits teach you, or have the ability to teach you magic during the Sabbath. And this rings true, well, it resonates with me because one of my biggest interests in magic, specifically like grimoire magic, is that there are spirits that teach magic. And that a lot of early magic was taught by spirits. It wasn't really taught by people. And I'm curious about the application of the magic that spirits teach in the other world on the mundane world. Once you've come back and you have that knowledge, what does that usually look like, if at all?
So things that you might learn from spirits, it really ranges. You could learn a specific spell, right? So you might come back, and usually when this happens, it might not always be like super clear, but you might, after you come back, you might find, there's these words sort of jangling in my head, and I heard this when I was there, but I can't quite make it out. And so you sit down and you start writing out, and then here's the spell for a specific purpose. Maybe you're shown a sigil. Maybe you're told about specific plants. Of course, in the case of a spirit telling you about herbs, you might, especially if you're going to ingest them, please fact check. Spirits are not above being fact checked. But there's so many different ways that we can learn from spirits and the different types of knowledge. It's really limitless. So from things that are very practical to things that, maybe something that you learn is a whole specific set of rituals. It's limitless. It's quite amazing to think about.
Absolutely. The big thing about this show is we're really trying to find the parallels between the occult and the paranormal. And I've had a couple witches on who specialize in using their magic to investigate the paranormal. And I've asked them, have you ever talked to a spirit or communicated with a spirit and have them teach you an effective way of communicating with them that they find suitable? And this was kind of a mind-blowing concept. They hadn't really thought of it this way. And I'm very curious if in your own practice, or people that you've spoken to who've read your book and things like that, if they've garnered information from spirits about how to contact spirits in their practice.
I guess I haven't had anybody like specifically reach out to say something like that. I think people tend to lean more into the wow, like it was really refreshing to read that, you know, it's not as complicated to reach out. Sort of a left turn, but still based in this, you know, in this question and in this current sort of topic. I mean, we find that in folklore too, in specifically really in trial transcript folklore, where whether it's a familiar spirit or the devil himself who's appearing to the accused witch, but providing rituals for calling on them, right? So it might be a phrase, it might be calling out a specific name, it might be drawing something in the dirt. And so I think that's a really good example of exactly this, of a spirit saying, you know, this is how you can get a hold of me. This is, you know, if you want to talk, or if you need something, you know, this is my calling card.
Yeah, and it's such a cool concept. My mentor and friend, who's been a ceremonial magician for the last 12 years, he's mentioned to me on numerous occasions that a lot of times when, you know, in that system, obviously spirits need to be bound because they don't really want to be here. We can't really trust them. And this is a very specific kind of chthonic entity that they're working with. But he's mentioned to me that when he's asked them about methods of contacting them again, easier, it comes out to be very similar to a spell in witchcraft. You know, you put this herb and this herb together, you say these words, and I show up. And one of his theories is that early witchcraft maybe sort of like ceremonial magic might dovetail into early modern witchcraft. And I've always just really thought that was a really cool theory. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is, do you see a difference between traditional early modern witchcraft and cunning folk and cunning craft?
Yes. So this is a question that also comes up a lot. In traditional witchcraft, we lean, again, really into folklore, and part of that is folk magic. And especially when we're looking at places like the British Isles, so England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, even like other places within Europe, as well as the early American colonies, there are practitioners of folk magic. And broadly, we might call them cunning folk, cunning men, cunning women. And something that I think is important to distinguish is that folk magic is different from witchcraft, right? There are many different magical practices. Not all of them are witchcraft. And witchcraft can involve folk magic. So specifically, again, in traditional witchcraft, we often look to recorded examples from the cunning folk, from the magic that they were doing, the spells and the charms and the things that we can find. But it's important to make a distinction there, because what happens otherwise is we start to erase the identity and the uniqueness of that cultural group. And it's really kind of disrespectful. The cunning folk, and it is hard to make, again, it's hard to make broad brushstrokes, because what you find is that a big part of what cunning folk were doing was using magic against suspected witches. So does that mean then that they, by that fact alone, are not witches? It depends, because there are many witches who work magic against other witches. And what we find is that there are some people who were cunning folk, who were describing themselves as witches, who were taking on the title. Certainly, I think from an outsider perspective looking in, I think people would have, you know, maybe referred to them as witches here and there. But what I think is important is that just because maybe some also refer to themselves as witches does not mean that's true for the whole. So, like, for example, there are some practitioners of things like hoodoo who might also refer to themselves as a witch. Does that mean then that all hoodoo practitioners are witches? Absolutely not. So I think that there is a distinction to be made. It's not always clear cut, but most things aren't. And so I think the best thing to do is to never assume how somebody else is identifying, even somebody way in the past, and to look into it, to be curious, to ask questions.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a fascinating nexus point between all these practices that, kind of, intermingled, but then are also very separate. And I have to say that the research you did for both of your books is really impressive. And I'm curious, it seemed really exhaustive. I mean, you really put a lot of effort into finding all these sources and notating them and even putting down the page number. A lot of people don't put that kind of attention to it. And I'm curious about the journey of research and what that's like for you as a folklorist.
Research is something that is really important to me. I always like to tell the story that sometimes my family makes fun of me because of how many times I say the word research. But books are also really important to me, and they always have been. I also am somebody who just loves a good mystery. So it's so easy for me to fall down these ridiculous rabbit holes. One of the ones that I love telling, when I was researching the Witch Sabbath book, and I was really trying to find at least the closest I could to the earliest use of the word Sabbath in connection to witches. And one of the rabbit holes led me to look at this scanned pages from an original document from the 1400s, and I'm talking like hand-painted calligraphy Latin. I don't read Latin, but what I was doing is I was scanning the sentences like I was reading because I knew what the word I was looking for in Latin. And luckily, I only had to do that for like 50 pages. And then I found that this was a dead end and it wasn't actually what I needed. But that's important to me because I want to find those answers. Because otherwise these things start to get lost. And I want to preserve those things. And also too, I mean, with the Witch's Sabbath, like a lot of this information too is often left in the academic sphere, and we're not finding it brought into our sphere as practitioners. Unless you're really aware and you're seeking out sources, books, in different sections of the bookstores. So like folklore studies, mythology, history, anthropology, you're not going to find a lot of this information because it's not marketed towards witches.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've read a couple of the more academic texts, and as valuable as they are very dry. They are hard to get through. But the information that you put, especially in The Witch's Sabbath, it's fascinating and it's extremely valuable, and it gives a really good context for all the things you talk about in the rest of the book. Obviously we're about to go to our patron section, but for our non-patron listeners, where can people find you?
So people can't really find me anywhere these days.
I was going to ask you about that.
But I have progressively more and more moved away from social media. So the best place you can find me is in my books and when I pop up on cool podcasts. I did just self-publish a book.
You did? I had no idea.
Yeah, so it's called All Them Witches, Folk Tales and Rhymes. It's a short collection of original folk tales and rhymes, all having to do with witches.
That's so awesome. Well, Kelden, I want to thank you so much, and we're about to go to our patron show. So all of you non-Patreons supporters, come to the Patreon and continue hearing me and Ian talk to Kelden. And that was our conversation with Kelden Mercury. As always, if you want to hear the rest of that conversation, you can become a patron starting at just $4 a month. But that was our conversation. We really enjoyed having him on. We cannot wait to have him on again. And I really liked hearing his perspective on the history of traditional witchcraft and what it has become today.
Absolutely. And like we need to have him on again.
Yes, we will.
And even in the Patreon episode that you guys really, we keep the real good magic in the Patreon. But you guys are going to love that and going to love this one too. But there are some subjects that I really would love. I think we could have a whole episode talking about the witch mother and the witch father and subjects like the witch's devil and, you know, that figure and how it plays into practice. And, you know, I very much enjoyed his take in telling some stories from folklore, and it was cool to hear his drop about his self-published book, which
we're going to be definitely having him on again and talk about that as well. Thank you again for listening, and as always, we will see you again on The Strange Dominions.